"You're really going to do this to me? To your own child?" My wife screamed, desperate, in the court. I smiled, knowing I had proof of her lies. Now she lost everything. Have you ever sat in a courtroom and watched someone dig their own grave in real time? Because that's exactly what my ex-wife, Betty, did. But before I tell you about her spectacular courtroom self-destruction, let me take you back to where it all began. I met Betty 7 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue. She was vibrant, quick-witted, and had this infectious laugh that could light up a room. We clicked instantly, spending the entire afternoon talking while everyone else played yard games. We fell hard and fast for each other. Betty was everything I thought I wanted, and seemed to share my values about building a life together. Our first year was a whirlwind of romantic getaways, family gatherings, and planning our future. Looking back now, I realize I was so caught up in the fantasy of us that I missed the red flags. After a year of dating, I proposed during a sunset dinner on the beach. She cried, said yes, and we were married within 6 months. The first few years were good, or at least I thought they were. We bought a house, built our careers, and everything seemed perfect on the surface. Then last year, things started changing subtly. Betty picked up more night shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. At first, I was supportive, extra money for our future, right? But the patterns became suspicious. She'd come home with her hair and makeup freshly done at 7 a.m. Her night shifts didn't match the hospital schedule I'd occasionally glimpse on her phone. She started having sudden business trips for nursing conferences that she'd never mentioned before they came up. The first real clue came when I found a receipt for a hotel in her car, a local hotel, on a night she was supposed to be working. When I casually mentioned it, she had an explanation ready. The hospital had put her up there during a snowstorm. It sounded plausible, except there hadn't been a snowstorm that week. I didn't want to be that paranoid husband, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. So I hired a pie. Best money I ever spent, though the results shattered my world. The pie's report was thorough and damning: photos, videos, text message records. Betty wasn't working night shifts. She was meeting a cardiac surgeon from her hospital at various hotels around town. The business trips, long weekends with him at beach resorts, all documented in painful detail. The affair had been going on for months. They weren't even particularly careful about hiding it, holding hands in hospital parking lots, kissing in public, acting like a couple in restaurants far enough from our neighborhood that they thought they wouldn't be recognized. The pie even caught them shopping for furniture together, like they were planning a future. When I confronted Betty with the evidence, she did what she always did, tried to manipulate the situation. First came the denial, then the waterworks, then the blame shifting. It was my fault for working too much. I wasn't emotionally available enough. Classic cheater's script. I filed for divorce the next day. That's when the real nightmare began. Just as we were getting into the thick of divorce proceedings, Betty dropped her first bomb. She was pregnant. She immediately filed for temporary spousal support, claiming she needed it for the baby's sake. Despite having a solid prenup and clear evidence of her infidelity, the first jurisdiction's laws were frustratingly clear. Until a paternity test could be performed after the birth, I was presumed to be the father and required to provide support. The next few months were hell. Every week, Betty would demand money, always with the baby as her excuse. Need money for prenatal vitamins. Need money for maternity clothes. Need money for doctor's appointments. Each request came with theatrical performances about how I was abandoning her and my child in their time of need. The temporary support payments were bleeding me dry. $2,000 a month, plus she was still living in our house while I stayed in a cramped apartment. I had to watch my savings dwindle, knowing full well that the child wasn't mine, knowing that she was probably using that money to set up her new life with her affair. The worst part was seeing her social media posts, playing the victim role to perfection. Pictures of her baby bump with captions about staying strong and doing it alone. Our mutual friends started taking sides, with many believing her version of events. Even my own family struggled with it. My sister called me one night, practically begging me to step up and be there for Betty. My mother kept sending me articles about the importance of father figures. It felt like I was going crazy. Was I the only one who remembered that Betty was the one who had cheated? That she had systematically lied and betrayed our marriage? Every 2 weeks, I had to sit through court appearances where Betty's lawyer would paint me as the heartless husband abandoning his pregnant wife. Each time, I had to bite my tongue and wait for the paternity test that would prove what I already knew. The legal system's presumption of paternity, designed to protect children, had become a weapon in Betty's hands. But Betty had made one crucial mistake. In her eagerness to milk the situation for all it was worth, she'd gotten sloppy. She'd forgotten that lies, no matter how well crafted, have a way of unraveling. And as I sat in that courtroom watching her play her final card, I knew her house of cards was about to collapse. Update 1. The day of the final hearing arrived with a tension you could cut with a knife. As the judge walked in and everyone rose, I could see Betty putting on her well-rehearsed, vulnerable expression, one hand protectively over her belly. The hearing began exactly as I expected. Betty's fresh-faced lawyer, practically sweating through his new suit, launched into what sounded like a script from a daytime soap opera. "Your Honor, my client has been left in an impossible situation," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "She is pregnant, unemployed, and struggling due to the emotional and financial strain caused by this drawn-out divorce. The stress has made it impossible for her to maintain employment, and she fears for the well-being of her unborn child." My lawyer sat beside me, calm and collected. He'd seen this kind of performance before, and we'd prepared extensively for this moment. He let Betty's lawyer continue his theatrical presentation, watching as the young attorney gestured dramatically about Betty's supposed hardships and my alleged abandonment. When Betty's lawyer finally finished his emotional appeal, my lawyer stood up. His presence commanded attention in a way that made Betty's lawyer look like an amateur in comparison. There was no drama, no theatrics, just quiet, lethal competence. "Your Honor, while we certainly sympathize with Ms. Adams' situation," my lawyer began, his voice measured and professional, "we must clarify a few things before proceeding. First and foremost," he turned to Betty's lawyer, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, "who is the father of this child?" The question hit like a thunderbolt. Betty visibly stiffened in her chair, her carefully constructed facade cracking for just a moment. I knew that question was coming. We had discussed this strategy at length. Betty didn't. She had assumed she could waltz in, look vulnerable, and walk out with a fat check without anyone questioning the fundamental premise of her claim. Her lawyer froze, clearly unprepared for such a direct question. "My client believes it is the petitioners," he answered weakly, already sounding unsure of his own words. I had to suppress a laugh. "Believes?" My lawyer didn't even flinch at the absurd response. "She believes," he repeated, his tone making the words sound ridiculous. "So there's no proof." The judge's eyes narrowed, his attention now fully focused on the proceedings. "Ms. Adam," the judge interjected, his tone carrying the weight of years on the bench, "have you had a paternity test done?" Betty's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She was trapped, and she knew it. I just assumed," she stammered, her practiced victim persona crumbling. "You assumed," the judge repeated, clearly unimpressed. "Ms. Adam, is there any evidence to suggest the petitioner is the father?" Her lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Betty had gone pale, her earlier theatrical tears forgotten as real panic set in. And me? I leaned back in my chair, finally able to enjoy watching the house of cards collapse. My lawyer was ready for the kill shot. He stood again, his movements deliberate and confident. "Your Honor, we have strong reason to believe this child is not my client's. In fact, we have evidence suggesting Ms. Adam has been deliberately misleading the court about several aspects of this situation." From his briefcase, he produced a thick folder, our insurance policy against Betty's schemes. "First, Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence regarding Ms. Adams' true motivations in this case." He began laying out documents on the table. "These are bank statements showing her systematic withdrawal of joint funds during the marriage, coinciding with her affair." He placed them one by one, like dealing cards. "Text messages between Ms. Adam and her paramour discussing plans to, and I quote, secure the bag through this divorce." Betty's face went from pale to ashen as the lawyer continued. He pulled out photos taken 2 months after our separation, Betty on vacation with her affair, holding hands, kissing by a pool, looking very much like a couple planning their future together. The timestamps were clearly visible in each photo. Additionally, my lawyer continued, his voice steady, we have evidence of Ms. Adams' attempts to manipulate this process from the beginning. He produced a series of emails between Betty and her friends, discussing strategies to milk the divorce for all it's worth and play the pregnant card. My lawyer slid the medical documents across the table. Your Honor, we have subpoenaed Ms. Adams' recent medical records, which show that her first confirmed pregnancy test was dated 3 months after she and my client had last been together. Furthermore, these records indicate she was already aware of the father's identity, the man whom she had been having an affair with. Betty's face crumpled as she realized just how thoroughly we documented everything. Her lawyer looked at her with dawning horror, finally understanding that his client had never told him the full story. The judge let out a long, weary sigh and shook his head. Ms. Adam, this court does not take kindly to deception. Given the evidence presented, there is no basis for financial support. The prenup stands. You will not be receiving alimony or additional compensation. Betty sat there, frozen in her chair, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. I could see it happening in real time, her brain scrambling for a way out, searching for another angle to play. This wasn't how she had imagined today would go. In her version of events, she was supposed to cry, look pitiful, and leave with a guaranteed monthly check that would support both her comfortable lifestyle. Instead, she had been publicly exposed, her manipulations laid bare for everyone to see. Her lawyer wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was staring at the floor, probably reevaluating every decision that had led him to take this case. Meanwhile, Betty was gripping the edge of the table like she could somehow hold onto the last shreds of her scheme. That's when the tantrum started. "But Your Honor," Betty blurted out, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that made several people in the courtroom wince. "This isn't fair. I'm about to have a baby, and he just gets to walk away." The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. The exhaustion of dealing with yet another attempt at emotional manipulation was evident on his face. This court does not make financial judgments based on emotional appeals. Your pregnancy has no legal bearing on this divorce unless paternity is established, which, based on the evidence provided, it clearly has not been, he said firmly, his patience clearly wearing thin. But Betty wasn't done. The judge held up a hand to silence her, but she was too far gone, too desperate to stop. "You're really going to do this to me? To your own child?" There it was, her final, desperate gamble. Even after being publicly humiliated, even after my lawyer had methodically exposed every one of her lies, she was still trying to plant that seed of doubt. The courtroom went silent, every eye moving between us, waiting for my response. Then I smiled. "You really want to do this, Betty?" I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm and controlled. "You want to go on record right now in front of this court accusing me of being the father, because we can get a court-ordered paternity test right now. Would you like that?" Her face twitched, the mask slipping completely. She had nothing. She knew she had nothing. And at that moment, so did everyone else in the room. Even her lawyer was slowly edging away from her, as if trying to physically distance himself from this train wreck. The judge didn't even bother responding this time. He simply turned to the clerk, his expression making it clear he was done with this circus. But Betty wasn't quite finished making a spectacle of herself. She stormed out of the courtroom after me, her heels clacking aggressively on the marble floor, face flushed with rage, hands shaking. "You're a monster," she hissed, loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. "You let me sit there, humiliated." I turned slowly, looking her up and down with the kind of pity you'd give a child throwing a tantrum. "I'm sorry, Betty. Which part humiliated you? The part where you tried to scam the court? Or the part where you realized I was 3 steps ahead the entire time?" Her jaw clenched so tight I could almost hear her teeth grinding. "You set me up," she accused, voice trembling with fury. "No, sweetheart." I smiled again, genuinely amused now. "You set yourself up, I just let you walk into it." She looked like she wanted to throw something or herself at me, But instead, she tried one last card, turning to my mother who had been quietly watching everything unfold. "Are you seriously okay with this?" she demanded. Mom hesitated for a moment, and I could see the months of manipulation and lies Betty had fed her flash across her face. Then she crossed her arms, standing straighter. "I'm not okay with what you did to him," she said firmly. "You had us all fooled once. Never again." Betty's lip quivered, and for a second I thought she might actually break down and cry real tears for once. Instead, we got the final explosion. "I hope you rot," she spat, stepping forward like she wanted to claw my eyes out. "Ms. Adam," the stern voice from behind her stopped her cold. Betty froze as two court officers stepped into the hallway. "Come with us, please." Her head snapped around, eyes wide with sudden fear. "What? Why?" "The judge has recommended an inquiry into potential perjury and fraud," one officer explained calmly. "You'll need to answer some questions." Her eyes went wide with genuine panic. "Wait, no, that's not." But they were already leading her back into the courtroom, her protests falling on deaf ears. I let out a slow breath, feeling months of tension finally leave my body. My lawyer patted my shoulder supportively. "Well, that was satisfying," he said with a slight smirk. "Yeah, it was." I watched as Betty was led away, knowing this was likely the last time I'd have to deal with her schemes. She was being dragged back into the courtroom, but I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The moment those court officers took her away, she ceased to be my problem. Later, I made sure to follow up on what happened. Turns out the judge wasn't just angry, he was making an example out of her. Faking financial distress? Bad. Trying to manipulate the court? Worse. Lying under oath, that's perjury, and the courts take that very seriously. Her fraudulent claims meant she was now under investigation. The court didn't just dismiss her plea for alimony, they flagged her case for potential financial fraud. Through her own actions, her desperate attempts to secure a payday, Betty had dug her own grave. And I couldn't think of anyone who deserved it more. Update 2. Through mutual friends and courthouse gossip, I learned that Betty's life began unraveling rapidly after that day. Her affair suddenly wasn't so interested in playing house once he realized Betty wouldn't be bringing a nice divorce settlement into their relationship. Apparently, he'd been banking on her securing substantial alimony before they started their life together. When that fell through, he started distancing himself. The perjury investigation hit her hard. Her new lawyer, the fourth one, since the one from the hearing dropped her immediately after, advised her that she was looking at potential criminal charges. The judge had been particularly thorough in documenting her attempts to deceive the court, from the fake financial statements to the deliberate manipulation of the pregnancy timeline. Her parents, who had been supporting her throughout the divorce, finally learned the full truth about their daughter's behavior. They'd been sending her money, believing her stories about me leaving her destitute. When they discovered she'd been lying to them too, they cut her off financially. Last I heard, she had to move out of her luxury apartment and into a small studio on the outskirts of town. Perhaps the most ironic part was that her attempts to secure a financial windfall had left her in a worse position than if she'd just honored the prenup. The legal fees from defending against the perjury charges ate through her savings. The investigation made it difficult for her to rent a new place or secure loans. Her credit took a hit as she struggled to maintain the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. Her affair, who had promised to support her through everything, was conspicuously absent during her legal troubles. Mutual friends told me he'd already started dating a pharmaceutical rep, while Betty was left to navigate her high-risk pregnancy alone. The stress of everything caused complications, forcing her to go on bed rest, which only made her financial situation more precarious. Some people, including a few of our old friends who had initially taken her side, tried to suggest I help her out of this mess. "She's still carrying a child," they'd say, conveniently forgetting that she had tried to pin that child on me fraudulently. I refused. Betty had made her choices, orchestrated her schemes, and now she had to face the consequences. The last I heard, she was trying to rebuild her life in a smaller town, where her reputation hadn't preceded her. The perjury charges were eventually pleaded down to a misdemeanor, but the mark on her record remained. She found work at a small clinic, making far less than she used to, living a life very different from the one she'd imagined when she plotted to exploit our divorce for financial gain. Through it all, I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, just relief that justice had been served. Betty had dug her own grave with her lies and manipulations, and in the end, she had no one to blame but herself. Sometimes, karma works in beautiful ways, and watching her face the consequences of her actions was all the vindication I needed.